Okay, I understand that our sound system is up and running. First thing we want to do is to wish Sister Ruth a happy birthday.
Same to you.
She just turned 35. Tonight's subject is lying. Actually, we're on page 37, and we're doing surrogate motherhood.
No, I came right away.
Okay, that's good. But again, just always take as your focus, your starting point, what is the proper use of sex? What's the proper use of the generative powers? And the only proper use, boring as this may be, is between husband and wife, fulfilling the unitive and procreative aspects of the act. That's it. So unfortunately, that means that most everything they've come up with since then constitutes a deviation from that norm. So if obviously surrogate motherhood is one of those that's not going to pass the test. What are we talking about with surrogate motherhood? I have to go back and scratch my head because they come up with so many of these things. You got to figure out now, what are they doing with this one? And I guess basically what they're doing is having the husband somehow inseminate a woman who is not his wife, who then carries the baby to term with the idea of giving the baby back to the husband and wife after the baby is born. Now, where do you start there? How many things are wrong? It's not a question of whether it's wrong. Clearly, as you can see the example on your chart there, we've got Jim and Jane are married, and Sarah is going to be the surrogate mother. So what we are engaged in, not we but them, voluntary artificial insemination of Sarah by Jim, where there is no marital bond between Jim, the husband, and Sarah, the surrogate mother. So obviously, this is a violation of the unitive function of marriage. The obtaining of the semen, of course, basically is by masturbation, which is immoral from the standpoint of the husband. You, of course, get into some very curious utilitarian results because the biological parents are Jim and Sarah, whereas allegedly the legal parents are Jim and Jane. So obviously you got an invitation to trouble already. Legally, the results are a mess because sometimes the surrogate mother decides at the last minute not to give up the baby, but she's already signed a contract to do so. So you're going to wind up in court. We've had numerous court cases result from these contracts, and I don't know if they're still as popular as they once were for that reason. Basic problem, of course, as it says somewhere here, why not just have Jim jump into bed with Sarah, who's not his wife? I mean, certainly it would be more natural, but obviously they don't want to do that. There really is no socially redeeming value, and certainly no morally redeeming value to this situation. It's contrary to the nature of the contract because the husband and wife have given to each other the mutual and exclusive rights to create the child, and now they're farming out the creation process with respect to another woman. And it violates the unity of the contract, which requires just one man and one woman, not one man and two women, where the woman who's having the child is not the wife. I don't know what to say about this because frankly it's got so many things wrong with it, there's no place to start. Or perhaps I should say no place to finish. Artificial insemination. Similar problems, excepting, of course, at least presumably it's with the husband's own wife, but it requires masturbation in order to do it, and therefore violates not only from the standpoint of the husband, the act that he's engaged in, but it's also a violation of the unity of the husband and wife because this is not natural procreation between them. So it's a violation of the matter of the contract, which should be the husband and wife acting together in a unified way in order to produce the child. That reference to why not let the donor jump into bed with the recipient, that would really refer to surrogate motherhood, not so much to artificial insemination. Although, I'm sorry, I take it back. Artificial insemination could be from the husband to the wife, but that's not what normally happens, is it? What it is obtaining the sperm from some completely unknown man and inserting it into a woman who wants to get pregnant, whether she's married or not. And of course, we have all kinds of scandals, like it turned out that one physician who was obtaining the semen was actually producing just his own semen, nobody else's. So he wound up with about 300 women with the same father to their child. And since this is supposedly anonymous, that means they're all half brothers and half sisters, and they don't know it, which means they could wind up getting married, and they don't know it. Again, as I say, where do you end? Not where do you begin?
Does this include times when, and I don't even know if this happens, when they seek another donor who sleeps with the wife?
Well, that at least, frankly, that's at least more natural. All that is adultery.
But the purpose on it being to inseminate.
Well, yes, yeah. That's why it says at one point here in your notes, why not just let the donor jump into bed with the recipient? This is bizarre.
When they have children, like if there's that intermarriage, there are these blood relatives, and then they can get deformities and various bad things can happen.
Well, your problem really is this is a situation where they're half brothers and half sisters. They're they're almost like brother and sister, except just slightly removed because of the diversity of the mother. And yes, you are begging for problems. And this is not purely hypothetical, because look at the problems they had within the European royal families at the end of the 19th century, with many of them having hemophilia as a result of so much inbreeding. It is possible to obtain a dispensation from the Catholic Church to have first cousins marry, but having half brothers and half sisters, I mean, you're really pushing the envelope genetically. But and again, in the case of the physician I mentioned, eventually it all came out. So, oh, what a lovely mess we have, you know. Plus, of course, you're begging for lawsuits all over the place. It makes the attorneys happy when these things don't work out right, but it's the natural result of having completely perverted the nature of the use of sex. And we've seen, and most of us are old enough to have witnessed in the last 40 years a complete inversion of morality in the United States, Canada, England, Western society in general. So that what was once immoral now has become moral, and what was moral has become immoral. Just as the Bible says, in the end times, good will be evil and evil good. And that's what's come to pass. And the results of free sex, the results of consequentialless sex, that was thought to have been heralded by the invention of the pill back in the 1950s have simply been horrendous for society. We not only have massive problems within the family in terms of keeping the family together in respect to divorce, but I think we're now up to something like 58 million abortions in the United States. So there still are consequences. The idea that somehow the invention of birth control would eliminate the possibility of the need for abortion just hasn't worked out, to put it mildly. Not to mention the fact, of course, we have to realize that the contraceptives are themselves creating, if you understand the truth of the matter, probably millions of uncounted abortions because of the contraceptives preventing implantation of the already formed embryonic human life. Unable to implant, effectively they have been aborted. They have been murdered in the womb. Now, I realize many people don't understand that, but that doesn't undo the objective truth of what's happened. The argument under F, eugenics, of course, taken from the Greek, eu meaning good or well, and genos meaning the race. The idea of eugenics is that we would improve the race. This is straight out of Darwin. The idea of eliminate the unfit so that the fit may survive and will perfect the race, will perfect humanity. This, of course, was a primary intention of Margaret Sanger, originally in founding Planned Parenthood. They don't want to associate themselves with this, but unfortunately that's where it was coming from. The whole idea was we're going to refine the race and eliminate the unfit. And in many cases this had racial overtones. But the problem, of course, with eugenics is who are you eliminating? This is measuring the value of a human being totally by the body that he receives in procreation and not recognizing the unlimited value of the human person, which is present in every soul, regardless of the body that it is received by. And then, of course, you've got that incredible example, which I know Dr. Waters has given you many times, but in the case where the father had syphilis, the mother was mentally retarded, the children were diseased, and the 13th child, what would you do with it? Obviously abort it. You would have just gotten rid of Beethoven. Well, maybe you don't like Beethoven. Okay. I have my trouble with him too, but I think he was a genius, I guess. The history of humanity, the number of people we've eliminated by these programs is so great. It has been said that you get a Da Vinci or a Michelangelo about once every 500 years. Well, we may well have eliminated him. We may have lost the genius that society and history needed at this time by this process. Who knows? Okay, so somehow we're on to baboon heart transplants. I'm not quite sure how to fit it into eugenics. But it's an interesting one because it gets into the question of may we do experimental processes. And I remember when they were initially doing the first baboon heart transplant. Now, of course, they don't do these anymore because they can do human heart transplants, which have their own problems, as we've already seen. But I always thought it was really almost humorous when they consulted an ethicist, I'm not sure if it wasn't Kaplan, with respect to the ethics of a baboon heart transplant, because he couldn't see anything wrong with it, except he thought it might have violated the rights of the baboon. Seriously. Now, of course, ethically, tell me what's wrong with it. With a baboon heart transplant.
You don't know what's going to happen. You're taking a risk with the
Well, you take a risk anytime you do something. I think you're pointing to the fact that it may be experimental and not justified. That's always an objection, but if let's assume that one has no other alternative to survive, then would it be immoral? Well, this ethicist, utilitarian ethician, thought it would violate the rights of the baboon. Just for the record, in case somebody is listening to this who hasn't been in this class, baboons don't have rights, okay? We deal with that in other contexts. Right requires that you have some kind of moral responsibility, and baboons don't have moral responsibility. It's okay for them to do whatever they bloomin' want to do. But is there anything wrong with the procedure itself? No. Ethically.
Not in the same species.
Look, there's nothing wrong with it. Not a bloomin' thing. Because after all, we've been putting pig valves into human hearts forever. If somebody has a medical malady and you can help them with either an artificial device or by transplanting something from an animal, the animal has no rights. The human being has infinitely superior status to any animal. And therefore it's perfectly licit to use the things of God's creation to save a human life. And as far as the baboon is concerned, it's no more immoral than it is when you go down to McDonald's and eat a hamburger sandwich, which is a little rough on the beef. I always used to be amazed at these eco-freaks who would go out and spend all their time as some kind of political action to try to save the baby whales, and then take a break and go back to their lunch at McDonald's, as if indeed hamburger does come from hamburger heaven. You know, the Chicago slaughterhouses are not necessarily preferable to what happens to the baby seals. But as far as the using a baboon heart, more power to them, if it works. The ethical problem, as you raised, has to do with whether you're taking an undue experimental chance risk. That is pertains to the normal ethics of any medical treatment. You are not, if you turn the page, you'll see at the top of 38 or at the bottom of 37, any experiment must be done primarily for the good of the patient, primarily, directly. The Hippocratic Oath required that. The whole tradition of medicine has always been that the only thing you do, anything that you do, has to be done for the good of the patient. But in recent years, they've broadened this a bit to include 3 criteria, only one of which is the good of the patient. Now they take into account the things like what good will it do for mankind? Can it save other lives? Well, all of that's wonderful. And it's fine if a patient wants to consent to something like that, but the primary judgment has to be, is this something that's going to help the patient himself? And if you are in any way jeopardizing the health and well-being of the patient in order to achieve some good end for mankind, what you've engaged in is utilitarian ethics. Maybe not at its worst, but certainly not at its best, because you have deliberately damaged in some way the patient in order to do something good for someone else. That's an evil means to attain a good end. If the experimentation is either neutral to the patient or potentially good for the patient, that's all right if done with the consent of the patient. But it's always got to be patient-centered and not in terms of some kind of a benefice to society that somebody else is liable to think has value, because then you very quickly get over to the point where you're putting pressure on people to consent to things that are not good for them. This is one of the problems with euthanasia, as we've already witnessed out in Oregon, with the Oregon euthanasia law, where they say, well, it's only with the consent of the patient if they decide that they don't want further treatment and they decide that they want to take these pills to end their lives, that's law. In Oregon, right now, today, we have euthanasia. And the idea, of course, has always been, well, you're not making them do it. But then all of a sudden, counselors come along and say, you're costing your family an awful lot of money by staying alive longer. Can you imagine how much you could save them? I mean, for $20 worth of pills, we can alleviate your suffering immediately, and you can leave all kinds of money for your burial and for your family. The pressure put on people is inevitably going to be great to tempt them to commit suicide. And the road to hell is paved with good intentions. We are always given all kinds of reassurances that whenever somebody comes up with one of these cockamamie ideas, nobody's going to be hurt, everything will be done voluntarily, there will never be any negative side effects. You can see this right now in the case of same-sex marriage, where it's been sold on the basis of it's only good for the people involved. This is what they want. They just want to be happy. It won't hurt anybody else. Here we are in the state of New York, and we have restricted conscience exceptions for some religious groups. But there are a lot of people in the state of New York right now today who are in legal jeopardy. If they, for example, a caterer doesn't want to offer his services to a homosexual wedding, he runs the risk of being sued in the state of New York because this can now be viewed as discrimination against the couple getting married, in quotation marks. So private business is not protected by these alleged protections that were extended to certain religious groups, but not to all. And the only thing that's left being even thought about being protected is the individual conscience. That's all that's left. Because what we've done is to legally erect a kind of public approbation of what is alleged to be marriage, but is counterfeit marriage. And now everybody is asked to salute it, potentially under penalty of law, if they don't, in the right circumstances. And frankly, I worked to try to get another law passed, or at least brought up in the Senate, to protect those who are not presently protected, a Conscience Rights Act. And I presented this to my local state senator, who indicated interest. I presented it to the head of the New York State Conservative Party, and he was really interested in it and intended to talk. He told me he was going to talk to the state senators to try to get this introduced. This would be this last January. So comes January, nothing happens. I waited a couple months, and finally I contacted the head of the New York State Conservative Party again. He told me I couldn't find a senator who'd sponsor it. Now, this isn't even a question of not getting it passed. This is a question of legislators not having the courage even to introduce a bill, which means that all kinds of private businessmen throughout the state of New York and many other individuals who may be subject to violations of their conscience, they are and will remain legally in jeopardy if they follow their conscience in refusing in some way to cooperate with what the state has now made legally to be an alleged type of marriage. I say alleged because, as I've said in other contexts, this is not a question of giving the same right to homosexuals that has been given to heterosexuals, but rather what is being asked for and been granted in New York and a few other states is a completely new right, because the right to marry we've always had. Whether you're homosexual or heterosexual, you've always had the same right, namely to marry a person of the opposite sex. What is being asked for now and being granted in some jurisdictions is a new right, a different right to marry a person of the same sex. Opposite and same do not have the same meaning, unless you assume that female and male are completely interchangeable terms. As long as they are different for purposes of marriage, then same-sex marriage is different than heterosexual traditional marriage. So that what is being granted is not something everybody's always had. This is not marriage equality. This is something new and different that has been foisted on society by backroom dealing in the New York State Legislature and Senate, and of course in some of the courts in certain states like Iowa and others, Massachusetts, where these decisions have been imposed upon the populace without even consulting the populace, and in most cases against the will of the populace. And of course, such legislative or judicial acts actually do not have validity in terms of natural law, because they are contrary to the natural law, which ultimately is the eternal law understood by man coming from God himself. And you could pass a law, as we've done, saying it's all right to murder people, which is what is done in the womb by abortion, and that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't make it a legitimate law. And it isn't such in any jurisdiction, even though we've almost come to get used to it. Same way that the German people during World War II got used to what was going on in the concentration camps, even to the point of not exactly noticing it anymore. So much so, of course, that after the camps were opened up, General Eisenhower forced the local residents to go through them and look at what was happening. And of course, we don't exactly get to look at what is happening too. When was the last time you ever saw a commercial or a documentary on television showing you an actual abortion? Have you ever seen one? Why not? It's just a medical procedure. You get to see heart transplants, you get to see hip and knee replacements. What's the difference? It's just a medical procedure. It ought to be shown on television. Should have been shown from 1973 on. Everybody should have gotten to see it. But, you know, this is what we call a free press and free television, where the truth is manifested to everybody. This is one of the common goods of society, as we're going to see shortly, namely well-informed public opinion. So, indeed, this medical procedure ought to have been shown to the public, shouldn't it? So they could be well informed in terms of the political action that they would take in reference to it. It obviously hasn't been done. We've had 58 million abortions, and you still won't see it on television. I think one fellow running for political office tried to run one on the basis of you just can't stop him from putting that on, but I think it came to naught. Okay, top of 38. So, man is not to be viewed as an instrument for society. What we're really getting at when we say you shouldn't be experimenting with people, with medical procedures, is because when you're doing that, you're not treating man as an end in himself, you're treating him as a means to some other end. And if you want to see how to experiment with people medically, just go back and look at the Nazi archives. I mean, they were doing it big time. And of course, you'd want to talk about an ethical problem. The question, which is a legitimate ethical question, is should we or should we not use the medical discoveries the Nazis made by treating people in a completely horrific manner? I mean, after all, they made discoveries. They were not idiots. The German medical establishment was very intelligent. The Germans always were. You know, if we'd run World War II about 3 more years, we'd probably have lost it. But there's data there. Shall we use it? And after all, it's just knowledge. The question arises, how did we get that knowledge? How did we obtain it? Same way, how did we obtain certain stem cell lines that are being used for embryonic stem cells? This has, well, I guess we're past that kind of issue. That's an early on issue, but that's one of the questions that arose. Should you be able to use the embryonic, the medical benefits that were obtained by using embryonic stem cells that were killed in order to obtain the cells? The embryos were killed to obtain the cells. And that even confused many Catholic theologians and ethicians when it first came out, and frankly, it took a couple 2-3 weeks before it became clear that the answer was no, you should not even use those stem cell lines. They were ill-gotten. You should not be using ill-gotten goods any more than you should be using stolen money. It's hot merchandise that we're dealing with. You can see it in other contexts. If I tell you, here's $1 million, go live a good life. This is wonderful. Why not? And you might ask me, well, where did it come from? And I say, don't worry about it. It's your $1 million. Go do what you want. And of course, it is a legitimate question to ask, where did it come from? And if it's ill-gotten goods, you shouldn't be using it, right? And that's the same problem we have in terms of these embryos, and it may be the same problem with reference to the German research. I don't know, I haven't worked out that one. But the main principle to remember is that we ought not be using people for wonderful purposes. The worst crimes against humanity have been executed precisely by using people for wonderful reasons. I mean, after all, if you go back to the German Republic, the Weimar Republic, back in 1920, remember, all this stuff with the euthanasia and the eugenics and the barbaric treatment of people, where did it begin? It began in the medical community. Sociologists, psychiatrists, people like Binding and Hosch, who wrote this wonderful treatise on the release of the destruction of human life devoid of value. Only a German would come up with a title like that. And they're famous for their huge, long titles and their scholarly research, but just listen to the words: on the release of the destruction of human life devoid of value? Devoid of value? This was the theoretical, scholarly basis for the whole movement that began under the Weimar Republic, and then, of course, it was the Nazis who picked it up and did it on a grand scale against the Jews and against 6 million Jews and 7 million people who opposed them, many of whom were clergy. Hitler got all the bad rap, but the initial work was done by people in the medical community. And of course, the people in the medical community, what were they selling? We're going to help society. We're going to help people. We're going to alleviate them of the pain of suffering from mental illness. You won't have to suffer the pains of mental illness anymore because we'll just put you to sleep. And of course, the problem is that whole rationale becomes then, well, political dissidents. How do you treat them? The Soviets picked up on that one for many, many years. They knew the Geneva Conventions prohibited actions against political dissidents, so what they did, if you disagreed with the Soviet system, they had you declared mentally unbalanced. So they wouldn't send you to a concentration camp, they would send you to a medical facility. And when the Berlin Wall came down and the Soviet Union collapsed, first thing they had to do was go back into those psychiatric hospitals and figure out how many people were really crazy and how many were just stuck there. by the political system. And of course, remember another thing, you can't do to people if you're simply punishing them because they're political dissidents. You're not supposed to torture them, for example. But in a psychiatric facility, what were they doing with the people? Oh, they had little things like they put them into a very tight, wet kind of bag, which they would then heat it up and dry it out and shrink them up to the point that they became like human prunes. And you'd be amazed how many people recover their sensibilities when this happened. Or another thing they do is they'd give them something analogous to insulin shock therapy, where they'd raise their temperature up to 104, 105, and then bring it back down. And they do this a few times. Again, the political healing was amazing. How many people got better, quote unquote. My favorite one, though, was the one where they take them and drop their body temperature almost to the point where they die. You know, it's like to get colder and colder and colder till you practically die. Then they'd warm them back up to room temperature, and when you just got to room temperature, they'd run them through it again. You know, after you go down and up a few times, again, it's amazing how people got psychiatric cures. But please notice, this was what? Medical treatment. Medical treatment. And therefore they could do these things to them, which if they were doing it to them in a concentration camp would be called torture. But it's not torture because we're trying to heal them. And of course the end justifies the means. And they're ill. Same thing under the Nazis. They were eliminating the unfit. The Darwinian aspect of the Nazi regime is well documented. They were clearly following Darwin's concept that you eliminate the unfit, and of course, primarily they wanted to get rid of the Jews that they considered to be ultimately unfit. And of course, they felt the same way ultimately against anybody that wasn't of the Aryan race. And all this in the name of the progress of society.
Where did lobotomies fit in?
Well, again, a prefrontal lobotomy, it isn't licit to ask whether the procedure works or not. The point is, at a given point in time, if you think a procedure has a good chance of healing somebody, and if they're willing to submit to it, this is legitimate. Nobody guarantees your doctor's going to save you. And oftentimes they'll say, well, look, this is a risky procedure, but we think we might be able to give you benefit, and you're going to die otherwise or something, and therefore it's always double effect, risk against benefit. If it's done ethically, even though we may find out 30 years later that what they're doing was wrong and didn't work, that's not the fault at the time. You can only do what you best understand at the time. I mean, good Lord, look what they did to poor George Washington. He's on his deathbed, so send for the physicians, so they come. How did they treat him? He had some kind of a cold or something, so they put leeches on him, or they did bloodletting. They drained the blood out of him. Amazingly, he got worse and died. But, you know, they were doing the best they could. You've got to distinguish between good ethics and good medicine. We all have to be careful about the medicine.
Are there any issues with the use of placebo in blind medical studies?
Well, you could have an ethical issue. Remember, the presumption is that the people participating accept the conditions of the study. So they know that they are receiving placebos, or they may not be receiving placebos, and they're willing to do it. You probably have a greater problem about the standard physician who gives his patient placebos and doesn't tell him he's doing it. But even there, it may be helpful because the placebo effect is great. So, I mean, if he says, take these, I guess he'd have to tell the truth if you asked him, what are they? But as long as you don't ask, well, no harm done, you know, and it may actually help you. Any other questions? I see floating around here. Okay, so the same thing with capital punishment. If it's done solely for the sake of deterrence, it's wrong. In other words, if you do it to benefit others, you can't punish a criminal more than he deserves in order to be an object lesson for others. Sometimes I suspect that's what the IRS is up to. I don't want to say too much, though, because they may get hold of this recording. That's all right. You can't get blood out of a turnip. But there is always that temptation on the part of those administering law to say, well, just make it a little tougher so that others won't do this. You see, you can admit and enjoy the benefit of a deterrent effect from a punishment. But the punishment must itself be justified by retributive justice. In other words, the punishment must fit the crime. The criminal must deserve the punishment. You cannot do it just because it's going to help reduce the crime rate. If it does reduce the crime rate, that's a beneficial side effect, and it's wonderful. And you can take joy in it. That's all right. But you're not allowed to take joy in the suffering of the criminal who's being punished. That's wrong. I know this sounds all too Christian, doesn't it? It's very difficult to understand that we aren't supposed to take joy in the suffering of the criminal. But we shouldn't really be taking joy or pleasure in the suffering of anybody at any time, for any reason. But you still can take joy or take pleasure in the thought that a criminal has been removed from the streets, that he is no longer threatening society, and it's all right even to take pleasure in the fact that it will deter others. It's just you can't punish him for that reason. I'm having flashed through my heads what they used to, what they used to do in the past when, they'd behead somebody and then stick his head up on a stake for the whole fortress to see for the next 2 weeks until he rotted off or something. That's deterrence. Or as Vlad the Impaler did, you would impale people and just leave them all over the place to rot. Was that bad? It was bad if you were the one receiving the treatment. I suppose it was effective for deterrence. I think we would consider it probably a little gauche today, but the problem that would arise might have to do with the unnecessary pain and suffering you'd be causing members of the family. It's really not going to bother the person you did it to. Except he had a tendency to do it to people that were still alive. So I guess they would have a reason to be concerned. So harmless experiments done for mankind are okay. And of course, especially if the people you're doing with it give consent. And now the next section, I'm not really sure how it got in here, but it's here, so let's look at it. It's an examination of logic, actually. We look at two statements. One says there is God, or there is a God, and the other says there is no God. And this raises an interesting question as to what do we mean by our use of certain terms? Because we talk about things like fear, doubt, certitude, ignorance. How are those terms used? Well, if you look at those two statements, there is a God, there is no God. Okay, so they're contradictory. One of them has to be right. One of them has to be wrong. To adhere to one, doesn't matter which one, without any fear that the other might be right, any fear at all, is what we call certitude. In other words, if I know that God exists, and I'm not at all afraid that there might not be God, then I have certitude. You do have to distinguish, though, between what's called subjective certitude and objective certitude. Subjective certitude, some people sometimes they have it like, I was absolutely sure that horse would win the race. That's subjective certitude, often causing the loss of money. What we are primarily concerned with is objective certitude, that is, based upon the evidence. And of course, remember, there's a couple kinds there. We have moral certitude and objective or metaphysical certitude. There aren't that many metaphysical certitudes. There are a lot of objective certitudes. But the problem with subjective certitude is people have them all over the place. You know, I'm subjectively certain of something. How many times am I wrong? Moral certitude simply means that I'm certain enough. I've taken into account all possible reasonable variant opinions or judgments, and I've consulted everybody I should. Therefore, I'm morally certain I can proceed with a certain act. I know it's right to do it because I've done everything you could have expected me to do to find out what the truth is. Objective certitude goes beyond that. That's where I am absolutely certain I've covered every base. There are no other bases, and this has to be true, and I have no fear that the contradictory might be in any way or chance of being true. To adhere to one of these contradictories, there is a God, there is no God, but you're afraid the other might be right, is what we call opinion. You just have an opinion. And so, you know, opinions are that and a cup of coffee or that and a dime will get you a cup of coffee. No, I guess that and $1 will get you a cup of coffee. My examples are dated. But everybody can give opinions. But we know when we say it's my opinion, we're hinting that it's not necessarily, I'm not that sure of it, because I'm afraid maybe the contradictory is right. If I adhere to neither one without fear of the other, I'm in doubt. In other words, there is a God, there is no God. Well, I'm not really sure. And if I hold one, I'm afraid the other's right. If I hold the other, I'm afraid the first one's right. So I'm simply in a state of doubt. I just don't know. I'm an agnostic on the question. Not knowing where you ought to know is called ignorance. In other words, if you're in the third grade and you're taking your multiplication tables and you're asked what is 3 times 3 and you don't know, you are legitimately called ignorant. Which of course makes me think of what happens when you go through the cashier lines these days. And if the computer doesn't tell the clerk what the answer is, they haven't got a clue. You know, somebody was pointing out, you know, they don't teach them things like the multiplication tables in many places now. So they just don't know. And then on top of that, guess what they now don't teach them? They don't teach them cursive handwriting. So they won't even be able to sign a check in the future. Well, I don't know, maybe they learn how to do their name or something. This is educational progress. But that's strictly speaking ignorance. You should know, but you don't know. That's not a moral judgment. I mean, you're not saying a person is morally bad because they're ignorant. And it's not telling them that they're stupid either. It's not the same thing. It's not telling them that they're lacking intellectual capability. It's just they don't know something. There's a lot of things I'm ignorant about. There's a lot of things we're all ignorant about. And of course we find out sometimes when we don't want to. The last one, I confess I'm not too familiar with this one. Not knowing where you don't need to know is called nescience. I'm not even sure how you pronounce it. In other words, you don't know it and you don't need to know it. I guess you'll never need to know it, so you're not ignorant because it doesn't matter.
Did you say that the definition of ignorance is you don't know it, but you ought to know?
You ought to know it, yeah.
So there's some moral responsibility?
Well, that has to do with whether you, first of all, you got to know that you ought to know it. If you don't know that you ought to know it, you just are ignorant, you know. It's no fault of yours, it's just you don't know. If you ought to know, if you're in the third grade and you were supposed to be studying those multiplication tables and you didn't do it, well, you're ignorant all right, but you also are a poor student and you have poor habits as a student and you're not living up to your obligations as a student to learn this, if you could learn it. Now, if you're too dumb to ever learn it, then you're not morally responsible, but you're still ignorant, and you're stupid too.
So there's different divisions.
There's millions of distinctions here. You've got to cover them all. Okay, any other questions pertaining to this whole area of sexual ethics? Yes?
I was just gonna go back to like
Matthew.
Nessian. So would that be like, if you were like let's say we're talking about an astronaut that's in space and he eats a certain way, I wouldn't need to know that. So that would be like me saying, because I don't know it, and I wouldn't need to know it because I'm not an astronaut in space.
You're probably right, but I'm ignorant of the answer. Susan?
We didn't really touch on cloning, but that, or.
Yeah, okay. I mean, there's a million things. You're right. I had a friend once who was trying to find a job teaching philosophy, and one of the positions that he could have applied for was to work for the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey circus. And he, if you bring this up, it made me think he mentioned that he might wind up having to teach a course on cloning to clowns. But at any rate, the problem with cloning, of course, what are we doing? I'm trying to remember the process. Oh, basically, you're taking. What are you starting with? You're
You're removing reproduction from the rights of the couple at all.
Yeah, clearly. I see the answer to all these things is, show me what you're doing biologically, and I'll tell you why it's wrong, because it always is. And what you're basically doing, if you're taking, how do you do it physiologically? Exactly. What are you doing?
Stem cell,
Stem cells.
You do it with the stem cells?
some kind.
I think what you're doing is you're taking the ovum.
You remove the DNA and you put in another one in.
Okay, I'm sorry. It's been so many years since I dealt with this.
There's different versions of it.
Yeah.
So it's not the material from the parents, the husband and wife. It's
Okay.
Material could be from another person, so there could be from another man or woman could be put in there. And then the mother will carry that egg, which will develop the genetics of.
Okay, what's wrong with that is all of the above. Because you've separated the act of procreation from the husband and the wife. You're putting together elements that are not naturally found
You
in.
may need a lot of them to get one succeed, so the other ones will die.
That's the other problem with in IVF, in vitro fertilization, which it was negligent to miss and fail to mention. This idea that you can start human life in some kind of a petri dish or some kind of an artificial context, and then you're going to implant it in some woman for it to develop. Well, of course, scientists are not going to waste all their time, medical doctors are not going to waste all their time on just one individual embryo, because that's inefficient. So what they always do is they make a bunch of them. And then, of course, what they do is they implant, frequently in IVF, they implant 2 of them. Now, the question is, what do you do with the rest? You either freeze them forever, or you dump them, which means you've just killed embryonic human beings, and a bunch of them in the process. And of course, they don't tell the poor couples many times. Couples think, we're pro-life, we're defending, or we're bringing more life into the world, and not realizing that in the process of doing it, they are participants in a process which actually kills a number of unborn children. Now, you have another lovely little side show on that one. All right, so they put a couple in, because they don't always take. Sometimes they'll put maybe 4 in to the uterus, because they don't always take. And then, of course, what happens when suddenly they find out, oh, they all took, and we've got 4 babies developing within the mother, and it suddenly becomes a medical risk to do this. Then they engage in what they call selective, what's the noun? I'm tempted to say harvesting. Some kind of selective elimination, where they basically go in and abort all but one. Because after all, they didn't make a bargain to have 4 children, they made a bargain to have 1. So you've killed the ones that you took out of the petri dish, and you've also killed all of the brothers and sisters that were in the womb in order to get 1 live child. Do I have to say what's wrong with that? I don't think so.
They're using language just like the Germans.
Yes, that again, you're right. All of this is covered by medical language that is propaganda in its worst sense. If you can color the language, it's just like I'm in favor of choice. The only word that doesn't have an object, a sentence without an object. Everybody's in favor of choice. But choice to do what? Shall we talk about the what? No, they don't want to talk about the what. They just want freedom of choice. So if you can control the language, you tell people, this is in vitro fertilization. This is an alternative way to allow couples that are infertile to have children. This is a way of bringing children into a loving and good home that they would not otherwise have access to. It's a way of bringing new life into the world. It all sounds wonderful, but there's dirty, black, little, hidden, horrible truths underneath it that are not being told, not being exposed, not being told clearly. It's the same reason you have fights over whether a woman or a girl who's about to get an abortion, is she going to be allowed or made to see an ultrasound? Does she get to see what it is she's aborting? Is this fully informed consent? You require it for everything else, but in many states, of course, a teenager can have an abortion without her parents being informed, without her being told anything about what's really happening, and without her seeing the unborn child that may already be moving and visible and formed within her womb. This is fully informed consent. This is a well-informed public opinion, which is one of the common goods. If you can manipulate the information, if you manipulate the media, I don't think it's any great secret that we have a media in this country, in Canada, England too, that is unbelievably biased in the direction of liberal politics. This is no state secret. For instance, in the United States, something like 8 or 9 out of every 10 of the major media figures vote Democrat. Okay, that's their privilege. But don't you think it would be nice if they told the people what they're doing and that they have evolved from what journalism once was, where it was, you really presented both sides of the story, so that now you're getting journalism that is very selective. Talk about selective elimination. You selectively eliminate the facts you don't want people to hear. Where you have, as they had in one case, where they had the election returns coming in, and the reporters were sitting around cheering for one side, visibly cheering when the numbers came in. This is not exactly what we call professional ethics. And we're talking about ethics. What is the ethics of journalism? Today, journalists are being educated and told, your function is to go out and change the world. A long time from Edward R. Murrow. Long time from just reporting the facts. No, today the idea is you're supposed to go out and change the world. That's why you're in journalism school. And if you don't change it the right way, you're not even going to graduate. So all of this has to do with ethics, has to do with knowledge, has to do with how we turn and twist and form public understanding of ethical and political issues. You can't get them understood if people don't know the truth, people don't know the facts. Just as you can't get, for example, the information out concerning the difficulties with a homosexual lifestyle. It's just not going to get out to the public because there's certain things that are not politically correct to say in public. Something that, as I've said in the case of smoking cuts your life expectancy. Well, homosexual acts cut your life expectancy too, but don't wait for PBS to broadcast a documentary on this because it isn't going to happen. But they'll do it on smoking any day of the week. Okay, what we're going to start, but we can't tonight, is political ethics. So next class we will begin looking at some of the contract theory of political philosophy, as opposed to natural law theory of political philosophy. There are more than one way to start a political system and to base a political system, but we'll begin that hopefully next week. Thank you.
Sound production copyright Olteen Library Services 2013. All rights reserved. www.aquinasphilosophy.com.